All right. Welcome back, everybody. This is Miriam Nisbet. We are getting ready to get a summary of our votes. And for those on the phone, I think you have gotten an email from Krista. You may have already responded, and we're going to need your votes because, as I understand it, we have a couple of ties here in terms of our votes. So
it's very exciting.
I'm going to ask Corey Zarek to give us a summary and tell us where we are. And Corey, what is the best way for us to hear from? Should we just ask the people on the phone one by one?
Sounds good. Let me give a quick rundown of what our top 4 projects to pursue are, and we can hear from the folks on the phone to help us break that tie. So our winner here they're all winners. The project receiving the most attention with 9 votes is something centered around proactive disclosures. And so folks had a lot of different ideas in this space, and we kind of grouped them all together so we can take this forward and you all can determine where to take it. But discussion of using technology and IT solutions to help tag records to make them more searchable and findable. More attention to disclosing categories of documents, popular records, review of requests that have come in order to help determine what should be disclosed. Just all the general proactive disclosure goodness. So that will be certainly a project for you all to pursue. It seemed like it got the most attention here today, so that's great. And then right on its heels, we had 8 votes for pursuing something in the oversight space. And so this was the general gist that FOIA could use some more oversight, whether it's from DOJ or OGIS or from outside audits, or perhaps even considering creating some sort of new independent authority to assist with resolving issues that come up in the FOIA process. So that received 8 votes and would be another contender for you all to pursue. And then the last 2, which each received 7 votes. One is the fees and fee waivers, subtitled Reducing Fee Animosity, which a lot of you wanted to look into. And then finally, we had another 7 votes for litigation review, and both looking at cases that may be in litigation that may not need to be, and also pre-litigation having attention and maybe some process or standards to determine whether to defend those types of cases. So if our folks on the phone wanted to chime in with a vote, it will help us determine which of these projects make the most sense to fill that 3rd slot. So we did hear from Dave Barr, so thanks, Dave. And if anyone else would like to chime in, now's your chance.
I think it's interesting that the lead vote of this committee, this is Clay Johnson from the Department of Better Technology, that the lead vote getter of all of this is that proactive hosting is basically, we shouldn't even need FOIA. That obviously is my top vote getter. I think after that, I would have to go with oversight. I think that's if that can be done in a scalable and smart way, I think that's probably going to have the most impact.
Good. Helpful, but not helpful in terms of breaking the tie. Who else do we have?
Isn't a litigation review a form of audit? Wouldn't
Yeah,
that be a form of oversight?
That's what I was going to suggest. I think those are close enough to be merged into one.
Does that work for you all? Because that definitely helps us all out. That's great. So then we have a new top vote getter. Sounds good. Why don't we put these all together here in the same little family? And so then that leaves us with exploring proactive disclosures, exploring oversight / litigation review, and then the fees and fee waivers. And my work here is done.
No, wait.
Now your work begins.
Let's hear from Andrew, Clay, and Maggie.
Well, you just heard from Clay, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
but Dave, Andrew, and Dave, I think was eager to participate at second. But didn't you hear from him already? Didn't you say?
We did. We received Dave's votes.
Do I get to vote twice?
So, all right, so how have we recorded Dave?
Dave sent us an email, and we put his proxy stickers up during the break.
Okay, great, all right. And how about Maggie? Maggie, are you there? Okay. We'll come back to that. Who are we missing? Do we have everybody? Everybody accounted for?
Andrew.
Andrew. Andrew, did we hear from you by email? Yes. Oh, okay, sorry. All right. So.
Oh, somebody just joined us. Who is that?
I think you're back on.
Okay, thanks. All right. Well, we have three large topics, and we're going to spend the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes. We're going to try for about 15 minutes each, devoted to these three topics, topic by topic, and we're going to see if we can put them in a more understandable way in terms of goals and how we would go about looking at them. So why don't we just take them in the order that we were left with, which is the proactive disclosure bucket, the oversight bucket second, and then the fees. And let's see if we can organize ourselves into what would it look like to examine these topics. We really need to have a goal, and I guess that could be, for example, that we would like to see a change in policy, or we would like to move towards a recommendation for legislative change. We'll figure out what that would mean for the topic we've chosen, and then some concrete steps on where we want to go from here. Remember, we've got a two-year time frame here, but we have to organize ourselves in a way that we can productively look at these issues and come out with something at the end. That doesn't mean we have to wait 2 years to talk about what we are seeing or what we think we would like to see, but that is sort of the time frame. For each topic, I am going to be suggesting that we have a volunteer, one person who's with a government agency, one person who's with a non-governmental organization or entity, and to be project leads and really sort of take charge of the topic and to solicit members of the committee to work with them. So if that sounds a little vague, it's because I'm going to need you all to help me figure out how we actually work. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to go about this, so I need people to start contributing to that. But could we start right now with the topic of proactive disclosures and see if we could put a bit more of a framework on it? What is it that we're going to look at? Where would we want to go? What would be our goal on this?
Yeah, I just thought it would be helpful to look at, to take now separately all those and see if we can.
I was thinking the same thing, that those little stickers
Yeah.
already have lots of different variations.
Exactly.
Yes.
So maybe we could flip it over, like the thing and the white, you know, the page, once we've gotten all the sticky, sorry. Just so that we can start to organize around.
And I think
And write some of
within
this
all
on.
those topics that are, you know,
Right.
on the stickers, within those, I think, you know, one thing we want to ask is, okay, what are the existing cross-cutting requirements? You know, what's already in statute or OMB circular or whatnot that's relevant to each of those? And then secondly, whether there are any informative models in existing individual agency practices. For example, I think Nuclear Regulatory Commission already puts all of its awarded contracts in a public reference room. So, you know, that's one model of proactive disclosure. So I think, you know, one thing is what are the existing cross-cutting requirements, and then what are some existing individual agency practices?
Another question to ask there, I think, are what are the barriers? I mean, there were a lot of suggestions around 508 and other technological or getting contracts and not knowing, you know, outside of a FOIA request. So if we could look at what the barriers are, it would help us, I think, as well.
This is Clay Johnson from Center for Technology. I just point out that whether the disclosure is proactive or reactive, it's often the same processes on the inside of government that need to be followed and used, whether that be protection or posting online or technology. And I think that, you know, inside of government right now, I think some of those processes are a real mess that we need to focus on, both at the compliance level and at the technical level. And so I think that sort of, at least where I can help there, is on the technology side of those processes.
I want to add what he said. I think agencies have to create a process. You know, there are no proactive, at least, you know, in many agencies, a proactive disclosure process. You know, they go to the FOIA people and they say, well, there's no FOIA request. You want us to take away from processing FOIA requests to deal with this. And well, that's, so agencies, and that's a resource issue, of course, but, you know, creating a proactive disclosure process when documents are created, so at the end of the process when the document's created, it's ready to go up there.
Another thing I'd suggest, as we pointed out, this is part of the Open Government Partnership, so we should probably get in touch with the group that is, or is at least related to it, so we should probably get in touch with the other people working on the same issue.
Well, at the same time, in what role can the public and the private requesters play in working with those in government who are going to be deciding what's proactive, what should be proactively disclosed or not? There are obviously a lot of issues that come up with that. What determines, okay, what's in the public interest? Do we have, how many FOIA requests we have for this topic or something else, besides obviously the resource issues? That's always going to be a problem with everything we're talking about here, unfortunately. But what role does that play in how, whether this advisory committee or more interaction? There's quite a bit of overlap then with a number of the other stickies that didn't fall within this, but since we're all supposed to be, both government and non-government, really on the same page with respect to this. It comes down to attitude. You know, we had the Reno memorandum, we had the Ashcroft memorandum, very different. What impact did those really play, getting down to the lower levels? One thing with, you know, many in the community have criticized the Obama administration, I'm not saying whether rightly or wrongly, with coming in as this most transparent administration and maybe not seeming very different from the prior administration, which certainly didn't have that reputation. I think it's more at the line level where we really see, since I know so many FOIA officers, that they're very fibrous, they want to get information out as much as possible, but they don't have that support at the higher levels, and so what role can the public play in helping that out?
Mark, I think maybe what you've just said points to, in different ways, having requesters help set priorities for proactive disclosure. In other words, with resources being an issue, that being one barrier, I think we've identified I've heard several barriers just in the last few minutes. One is resources, one is a lack of a process, and also a culture, maybe your culture fits into that as well. But also, given that, where would an agency put its priorities? What would you go for first in terms of types of records, but also in terms of trying to put records in the best, keep records, take records, collect records in the best possible way to make it easier to disclose. So it's both a priority in terms of what you would go for as your, I hate to use the term, but the low-hanging fruit that would be able to get out there pretty quickly, but also in terms of your processes so that you, for example, would collect and maintain contracts in such a way that they could be easily disclosed. So I'm just trying to sum up what I've heard so far.
And I would just add that, I mean, we're not, at least with proactive disclosure, we're not at the base level, because we've have had since 2009 like a whole process with the agencies identifying records and posting records and including examples of records, so we can use what has been done already as a guide or to help to help agencies going forward. And one of the things that in July, the best practices workshop is going to be on proactive disclosures, where agencies are going to be sharing like their successful strategies, and that can help guide our discussion as well.
One thing, though, I think we have to remember is that to really make proactive disclosure part of the culture of an agency, you need more than FOIA people at the table. So you need FOIA people, the open government people, IT people, records managers. And then you also need someone at a very high level that's going to support that kind of initiative that should outlast, administrations and just be part of the way we do business. So getting the right people at the table, I think, is maybe the first item of business to go forward with the discussion.
And I think the second might be Melanie's point. We need to find, as someone that's worked on trying to find a way to do proactive disclosure before, we need to find a fix, workaround, stalemate, truce, something with 508C compliance, which is a law that makes it really difficult to post records online, especially older records, even if maybe we're getting too far ahead of ourselves, but even a standard where we say only records that were created in digital can be posted online. So that way we don't need to worry about compliance, but 508C compliance, and I know it's jargon, but we need to look it up, and that's a key obstacle I want to get on the record.
What I would add too is I think we need to identify common sets of records across all agency lines. I think the more specific we can be, the more achievable it is to have proactive disclosure. But then I think we need to help agencies develop agency-specific kinds of records that are going to be of interest. The FDA might have a very unique set of records to them that would be appropriate for proactive disclosure. The FCC might have another. So I think as we think about this issue, the more we can flesh out and identify specific sets of records or kinds of records, the more achievable the goal is.
That's a good point. And cross-cutting records that many agencies keep in a similar system is a good target. For example, there are only a few travel management systems used by government agencies. And so if you work out, how to disclose from a few different travel systems, you can get almost all agencies' records.
Another huge thing, sort of a dividing line with proactive disclosures, are the documents that are pretty much releasable right in their entirety. Those are obviously way easier to have in buckets for proactive disclosure versus the far more complicated records, like you're talking about contractor submitted records where you have to go through submitter notice. So you can want to release those proactively, but the burden and the time to do it is very much something that needs to be factored in versus other types of documents that are more readily disclosable. So we have to kind of have sort of two approaches depending on the record.
Well, we also have to take into consideration where agencies have overlapping interests in jurisdiction. Our former and current DOD folks will remember back with GulfLink back in the 90s, and I had a case where DIA released a lot of information online in the earliest of the days of the internet, and then the CIA completely freaked out that all these records had been declassified properly through the system and pulled them all back until we actually did a FOIA lawsuit to restore them there. So there's going to be conflict even between agencies on some of these issues that we'll have to take into consideration.
We mentioned before talking about good examples. I'm sure we have lots and we can all throw them out, but the Department of State's website is a very good example to look at. I believe they quarterly post almost all FOIA releases online. So when I'm talking around town about what do you mean by proactively posting, or the default being when you release a record, post it, I say look at Department of State. I'm sure other agency sites have good websites as well.
Maybe one of the things we can do is identify best practices that already exist to show who we think are being leaders.
So what would be the perfect timing of this is the July Best Practices Workshop. Now, well, I'm trying to think how we best do that. That part of that whole purpose of that workshop is to have agencies give examples of how they've achieved, greater proactive disclosure.
Melanie, would you just, for the benefit of people who don't necessarily understand the workshop series, just briefly summarize what it is, because they've already begun, and this is the next
stage of it. So it's one of the Miriam had mentioned we have 5 FOIA-related commitments in the National Action Plan, and one of them is a series of what we're calling best practices, sharing of FOIA best practices, where we're identifying a distinct topic and then having a panel of agencies that have shown great success or progress in that area share with agency personnel or with the public. And the proactive disclosure workshop is going to be I'm trying to remember if that one's open to the public or not. We're having some open to the public, some for agency personnel, but the idea is to share successful strategies for improving FOIA with the idea of building on those successes across the government. And we've already had the first workshop, which was on reducing backlogs and improving timeliness, and it was really well received. And the next one is going to be on proactive disclosure. So we definitely can factor the two in, is all I'm saying. They can work together. Good.
That will assist.
Yeah.
Very, very much. Could I ask? I think if this is whatever this is, and that's where I'm going, how do we want to describe the goal of this committee with regard to this particular topic? Is there a succinct way that we can say more than just, we're going to be looking at improving proactive disclosure? That may be for right now all we can say, but I think we need to come out of this meeting with a stated goal, and then we can talk about what are the steps that we're going to take to get it. And again, I'm going to be asking for volunteers to lead the next step. Would somebody like to take a stab at it?
I think our overall goal is to increase the amount of government records that is proactively disclosed. I think the means by which that happens, I think we should certainly be very open to that, including recommendation for legislation, because I think a lot of things, such as the relationship to Section 508, are things that are difficult to resolve other than by legislation.
I think the second half of that also would be improving the public's ability to access what is disclosed. So the whole idea of it being in open format and searchable, so that we're going beyond just putting things up on the web, but really making it usable and searchable.
That's a good point.
I might articulate the overall goal as developing a roadmap for how to achieve proactive disclosures across the government or something like that. Because that's what we'll do. I mean, at the end of the day, we'll have recommendations for legislation, we'll have ideas, et cetera, but it's really a roadmap on how you get there.
And maybe follow something you said earlier, maybe try to identify types of records that are across the government where the agencies can strive to make these records available proactively. I mean, I've heard some, like travel systems, contracts, things we know the public's interested in, things across all government agencies. Maybe we can try to identify some of those as a way to try to find a way to get proactively promote more information to the public.
And I would just add that I hope, from my position, I hope that the category of records that a big chunk of FOIA releases is in that category. So when we say proactive disclosure, I think I would hope that would mean don't just mail the FOIA release to someone so they can put it in their desk drawer. If you go through the hours to process it, also throw it on the web so anyone else can see it.
But that strikes me that we need a common definition
Yep.
of proactive disclosure, because I was thinking of it in terms of documents that may not be requested under the FOIA. So.
Well, but it could be both.
They could
should
be
be-
right,
it
but
should
I think we
be
need a
both.
definition.
It should be both. It
Right.
should be both.
And I guess the stuff that's already been released under FOIA is the low-hanging fruit
Right.
of proactive
Right.
disclosure, because
I haven't heard that.
But
before.
it's,
Right. That's
but
where
it's
the
not all the fruit in the basket.
Okay.
I also want to add a caveat of some of the things where we don't want to undercut ourselves, since we're looking at FOIA, and one of the folks on the phone had mentioned the irony of that proactive disclosure almost eliminates the need for FOIA if it actually worked this way. And I know some agencies I've experienced, and I'm sure Crew, Epic, and some of the other groups have as well, where now we're getting letters that say, oh, by the way, go check what we've proactively disclosed on our website before we start processing your FOIA request. And we don't want to have that.
Yeah, this is Clay Johnson from the Department of Technology. That was me who said that, and I just want to express that I want us to be really cautious that the proactive disclosure route is not a cop by this committee to help tip and modernize the real problems of FOIA processing. I think that in an ideal world, yes, it was my position now. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have to FOIA for these. You wouldn't have to send in a Freedom of Information Act request to government for anything at all. However, the pragmatic reality of things, it always will be that Freedom of Information Act requests will have to be sent to government, and the method by which government does that now costs the government a lot of money and takes way more time than anybody would like, and it's a horrendous process. It needs to be stressed to the committee that we should focus more on, figuring out and fixing those problems than coming up with a solution that isn't pragmatic and likely won't be adopted, sort of an ideal world type scenario. And I'm fine with going the proactive disclosure route, but I still think we need to be anchored in the reality that, there are problems, there's a build on fire, and those fires need to put out.
Thank you, Clay. We're going to need to move to our next topic, so I want to close this one just for the moment by asking for 2 volunteers to lead us with the next steps, which would include, I think, putting together a statement along the lines of we're looking at developing or, well, I'm going to need you all to help figure out how to say this, but essentially our goal is a roadmap that would increase the amount of government records that are proactively disclosed in a usable way. That's a very, very, very high-level statement of a much more complicated issue. And in doing that, we would be looking at, for example, what existing requirements there are. We'd be looking at barriers and trying to identify what those are, looking at ways that those barriers are being overcome, and that would include agency and requester best practices right now, and bring that back to the committee, or because we're going to be soliciting public input on this as well. So could I ask for one government member and one non-government member to? Non. Okay, so Eric is our non-government.
I'll do it.
Okay, so David and Eric are our project leads on this. Anyone in the committee can volunteer to work with them, and you can volunteer to work on more than one topic. So, but we don't have to decide that right now, but we will be soliciting volunteers for that. Because we need to move to our next topic. We have approximately 20 to 25 minutes to cover the next two topics and get our project leads and some steps forward on that. And if we could turn to the second topic, which relates to oversight, and maybe we could do as we did before and start with sort of summarizing the stickies that we had to remind us of why we thought this was a good topic. And Corey, you're doing a brilliant job.
We had the litigation review piece of oversight, so we don't want to forget about that. But the general discussion was to explore whether more oversight through existing functions like DOJ and OGIS administratively makes sense, whether we want to fold in an audit piece to that, any sort of other overarching bigger body that we may want to explore, another independent authority beyond what already exists, exploring that, and then also folding in the litigation review piece of that. So we'll just call this the oversight project.
Okay.
To start with a review of what current oversight mechanisms exist, because there are the annual FOIA reports, there's OGIS, there's the DOJ OIP. There has in the past been a litigation review. If we could just look through a brief history of FOIA oversight mechanisms.
A little bit of IG.
Yeah,
yeah.
There have been some IG.
And there's also been some in Congress, congressional hearings.
Yeah, I agree.
So as with our first topic, one of the first things we're going to do is identify existing requirements. Okay?
I think the next step is to identify the gaps.
I think also a best practice evaluation, but not best practices internally, but externally. We're not the only country in the world, or even if we only want to look at states in the United States that have a Freedom of Information Act, and how have some of those other countries implemented oversight and to what effect? I instructed an Albanian delegation a number of years ago. This is the last vestige of communists that became independent, and within less than a decade they had created an ombudsman with teeth, which is where I got that suggestion on the OGIS side, where if requesters had a dispute with an agency, they would go to this ombudsman And the ombudsman internally would have an independent authority to tell the agency yes or no. I do not honestly know if it has worked in the last decade since or so I've met with them, but it existed, and we can kind of look around to see how other countries, the UK now has a process. I don't know how different it is than ours. But I know when I've been teaching the DC Bar course, when I mentioned earlier the Reno memo and the Ashcroft memo, and we talked about this litigation reform, and if you remember what the Reno memo said and the change in policy, Reno memo was, of course, Justice, we're not going to defend you agencies if we don't agree with your position. And I would always ask my co-teacher in the DC Bar, who's a colleague and friend from the Federal Programs Branch, how many times had Justice Department actually declined to represent an agency? And I do it now as a joke over the last 10 years because it's always stayed 0. Now, internally, that may be different, obviously, when you have some internal discussions, but it was the notion of what's the difference between the policy and the practice, and we want to merge the two.
So that might fall into the gaps analysis.
And I do think, just to pick that, you might have mentioned this, Mark, I think state FOIAs can be interesting to look at because they often have more and different enforcement mechanisms. I don't know if they work on the federal level or not, but it's certainly worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just going to say that obviously there are examples of cases where agencies made discretionary releases during the course of the litigation.
Absolutely.
And can I just add one thing also, not necessarily fill in the gaps or existing, but at the CFPB we've done some different things. And not only did we finally submit our first annual report, we worked with OGIS. We have an internal ombudsman that reports to the director that I get calls from if someone's unhappy. They can go to public liaison. They also go to our ombudsman. We have a process with that internally. We also have a policy that we do independent audits of our compliance program each year. So 2 years ago was the FOIA program. Last year was privacy. This year it's records management. Next year I'll be up again to do my independent audit. So we have auditors that we hire to come in to do a variety of different audits, and compliance pieces are part of that as well. So I've gone through it in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different practices. So I can certainly give my input in those areas as an agency that we've gone through a lot of those different pieces.
That sounded to me like volunteering to be a project lead.
Let's wait till the end.
Well, we are gonna need that pretty quickly. So I don't want to cut off discussion at all on this, but it sounds like we're identifying some steps, which is again starting with existing requirements, identifying gaps, and looking at best practices. And I would say that's in reality not just on paper, from other countries and also from the states. Other ideas for how we would go about examining this issue.
Well, looking internally, I don't want to rule out also on the federal level, as we sit in the National Archives, the ISCAP, Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, affiliated with ISOO, which in processing MDRs, mandatory declassification review requests, has been very successful from a public interest standpoint of looking at agency requests as a collective government entity. And I don't know, last stat, maybe somebody could correct me, was like over 50%, I think. 70% they were ordering or authorizing, or at least recommending maybe, the release of that information which an agency had held to be classified. So I look at that as an incredible success story, and also goes to when we look at the attitude in the agencies. When you've got multiple federal agencies telling a sister or brother agency that we disagree with your decision, it shouldn't have to come from the requesting community to say we disagree with your decision. There's something fundamentally wrong there.
And one thing, we look, it gets to the form of government if we look at compliance, more oversight of a law, whose responsibility is that in the government? I mean, it's really, can you assign that to an executive branch of the government? I mean, true oversight. OGIS and OIP do a wonderful job working with us, helping us see what's going on, what's wrong, and dealing with it. But the true oversight is that a legislative function, the way the government's set up? And a GAO, we can oversight within our own federal agencies. I can do some oversight and deal with compliance in DOD. And so is that something where, do you actually have teeth, the teeth that's necessary? Does it have to be something from outside the executive branch?
Well,
I don't know.
One step towards having an oversight agency is having an agency with rulemaking authority that covers all agencies. For example, Federal Advisory Committee Act, there are rules from GSA which apply to all agencies, operations under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Now, does GSA enforce them? I don't think they have, FACA police, but at least they issue a binding standard.
Well, maybe what we're talking about is accountability. Instead of oversight, it's accountability. To have agencies have processes in place that would show that they're accountable to their legal requirements, whether it's FOIA or any other law.
And that's what we do with the annual reports. It's an accountability to all the reports we have to the Attorney General. FOIA officer is accountable to the Attorney General. Public liaisons are accountable to the agency FOIA officer right now. So that's.
I wouldn't want to narrow its focus like that, because I think there's still room to consider whether there is an oversight role that could be created or expanded. And the other thing I was going to say is, if you're talking about oversight or accountability, you have to have measurements. What does it mean to be complying with the statute? So I think that's another task of this committee, which is...
Well, once again, starting with defining.
Right.
We can also look to the Public Interest Declassification Board, PIDB, as there's a morphing of executive branch appointments, legislative appointments, public sector involvement. It's similar in the way of the advisory committee, of course.
Well, let's give this one some authority.
Yes, it's called the advisory, but then we couldn't be called the advisory committee. Federal Authority, Federal FOIA Authority Committee. Can we do that?
And obviously, Congress already put into the statute, incredibly detailed requirements for accountability in terms of what's required for the annual FOIA report. I mean, there's a lot of data there that is, I think is rich and has a lot of potential to be used, and analyzed even further than it is. I mean, it's incredible what's already required to be reported by all agencies.
That's why we're going to start with existing requirements, because that helps define this. Okay, so I need my our volunteer project leads, please, and then we need to move to the next.
Either way, I don't care.
Okay. Sounds like...
Could we go? This is a pretty big one.
Well, let's just have two, one government and one non-government. Do you all want to step out and arm wrestle or toss a coin or what?
You have all the...
Okay, while they're deciding...
No, Mark's going to do it.
I'll do it.
Okay, Mark, and who's going to be our government?
I'll work with Mark. If it was Ann. I'll work with Mark.
Because I don't hassle your agency.
Yeah, I mean, we have a good friendship already.
Okay, that's great. Thank you both. So Marty and Mark are going to be our leads, and we've got some ideas for sort of what your steps would be, and we're going to leave it there, and we're going to turn to our last topic, and that is fees. Okay, so Corey, if you could quickly summarize for us sort of what those stickies look like.
We have got the general bucket of fees and fee waivers, potentially exploring whether or how to reform them, the possibility of uniform fees, whether we may want to revise or eliminate fees in some circumstances for non-commercial requesters, for example, and with the overall goal of reducing fee animosity, whatever that may mean to you.
Okay, so generally, one question is, do you reform? Do you eliminate? If you are reforming, is there a way to have a more uniform approach? And I guess the animosity issue is we leave out there as a piece of all of this.
This is another one of those where it does tie into something that we're doing existing in our project to have a common FOIA reg that we're doing collaboratively with a lot of people here, with both agencies and reps from the civil society. The idea behind the common FOIA reg is to have a core set of standards, and part of the reg, of course, would be devoted to fees, so that that project itself might help solve some of this. Will be addressing at least some of the idea of the uniformity.
So there's a tie-in to the other effort, even though it's just a piece of that. Might there be, this would be a place, again, where we could start with some research. The existing requirements, we are pretty much there in the statute and with the OMB guidelines, but might this be a place where if there have previously been efforts or ideas put forward for changing the fee system, it would be useful to look at? I'm guessing that we're not the first group of people to say, wow, what about fees? Isn't there a better way to do it?
This is, I think, a frequent topic of comments on proposed FOIA regulations. So that might be a place to start, to look at some of the comments on agency regulations that outside parties have made.
Well, in drilling down, standardization, I know, as I'm sure some of my colleagues here, some organizations are granted a fee waiver at one agency and then denied a fee waiver at another agency. Or especially now with the internet, who constitutes a representative of the news media in determining where you fit in a category?
So that again is going to sort of fall into what are some existing agency practices that could be informative or good models or bad models?
To maybe look for some bright line rules. I mean, I do think that creating a presumption that a 501c3 organization would qualify for reduced fee status or favorable fee status is a good bright line rule, because it seems like the problem here is that there aren't really bright line rules for the agencies to follow. So even within an agency, there's a lot of inconsistency, that an organization may for one request be granted news media status and then for another not be.
I'm going to go back to Miriam's first question. Are we looking at reform or what? I think it should seriously be looking at legislative reform that may take care of these issues. Because even if we draw these lines, something's going to come up in the future. It's going to be, okay, are they in the favored category or not? And I hate to be pessimistic, but it just seems so much and so many things change over the past few years, and it's going to be changing in the future. Do we have to seriously consider some kind of reform? And maybe doing research. I know other countries, the British have a whole different way of looking at fees and issues there, but maybe look at other countries too and see how they deal with this issue. How does it affect other issues within? Because I know from talking to FOIA requesters, it creates animosity even internally, you know, not just between us. It goes back 26 years between us and Nate.
I think that if you're looking at fees, you also have to consider the Open Government Act of 2007 provisions regarding what happens when agencies fail to meet a deadline and fees, and how well that's actually being followed within agencies. Anecdotally, from a requester standpoint, it seems like it's not really being followed very well at all, but it's a thing that needs to be addressed.
We're talking things that need to be addressed. According to DOJ reporting, collected FOIA fees make up only 1% of all FOIA costs, and they don't go to the agencies, they go to the general fund. So I guess the reason I use the term acrimony is it acrimony over something or acrimony over nothing? And some of my friends would be quick to say, well, it makes it, we use them to reduce our workload. And that's going to be probably a hard discussion we're going to have.
Well, but if you're, and I also think if you're using fees to whittle down someone's request and to pressure toward narrowing it, I think using you'll be able to get your documents more quickly if you narrow this request is just as effective as of a stick.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd be interested to know, following the act, actually one of the things that I thought might have worked to our disadvantage from the requester community was the notion that if an agency failed to meet the deadline and it couldn't charge fee waivers, or even with attorney's fees, that comes out of now your agency budgets, right, instead of the general operating fund. So there's somewhat of a disincentive to even resolve something administratively because there may be a cost. And I mean, this is going to come down to much of what we talk about financial, whether or not everything we'd love to see implemented could really financially be implemented. And that's going to be a great deal of the role of Congress to see if we're going to have any fees put in. But as Nate's saying, 1%, if 1% of is only going to really of being collected, really what difference does that make? Then why do we even have a fee issue? There's those types of, let's kind of weigh it, costs and benefits. Maybe that's the question. What is the cost and benefits of having fees or not having fees and fee waivers? Isn't that the ultimate question?
I also think
What's the cost to the agency of, evaluating fee requests, adjudicating fee requests, if you have to litigate fee requests?
And all that goes into whether there's a legislative reform or not.
Yeah.
Definitely, that should go into it. Absolutely.
And I think another item, I know something, as we were starting up and we were looking at how do we process fees, how do we collect them at the new agency, the discussion about delinquent requesters came up. Do we go after them? Is there a certain threshold where it's not, really worth it to go after them and things like that? So we even looked at it as a perspective of delinquent requesters. What's that threshold? And where it's a cost benefit to even consider just writing it off versus going after for a delinquent government debt.
we could also use this space to examine ways that new technology could make the process more efficient in a way that would both reduce fees for requesters and also reduce the agency workload. So better search mechanisms, ways to produce documents in electronic formats instead of on paper that would require paying duplication fees, those sorts of mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've identified a lot of things right here in terms of what we would need to look at. And I think there's an open question as to whether or not we're talking about reform or whether we're talking about elimination. I mean, that's a very rough way to put it, but we've identified lots of things that need to be looked at in terms of existing requirements, analysis that has come through with looking at regs. A number of entities have looked at across agencies at their regulations, and that would include fees. Remembering that this ties into the Common Rule Initiative, part of the National Action Plan, looking at existing policies and practices, including for federal agencies and also other countries, and looking at the cost and benefits of the fee requirements, and that would include what are fees being used for, the cost of collecting fees, among other things, the legal consequences, and those are, is it really working, and also bringing in how technology might help. So this is a huge topic, and I'd like to ask who wants to be the leads. Okay, so Ginger is raising her hand, and who would like to volunteer on behalf of the government? I'm looking at Jim because he's talked and thought a lot about this. Great. So we've got Jim Hogan and Ginger as our co-leads, and with that, I think we have a lot of work to do. Okay. So we are just about, we're, by my, both my watch and my phone, it looks like we're at 12:33. And unless there is something else that one of the members would like to add, we're going to move to the public comments. Mark.
Yeah, Mayor, if I can ask from a sort of a guidance question. So let's see, we said the next meeting is in October.
October 21st.
Right? What does the committee expect from the now 3 committees that we would have ready for October?
That would be one of the first things I would ask these groups to let the committee know. I think if you all can confer pretty quickly, I'm gonna ask everybody, all the members, including those, remember we've got a couple of members who are not with us today. We'll be bringing them into getting them up to speed. We also have the members on the phone. Everybody, I hope, will volunteer to work with one or even more than one of these groups. And maybe the first thing is to come back to the committee with what you think is a time frame and an achievable goal, or a set of goals for each of these. So it's going to require getting together, talking, consulting, and also listening to your constituencies. I know that's very vague, but I think we have to ask the group, the members, to figure out a way forward.
I have a question.
Ginger, yeah.
As a federal advisory committee, do we have some overarching deliverable goal that we hope to achieve within the 2-year time span?
Well, the overarching...
Like a written goal, do we want to make recommendations? Do we want to issue a report? What?
Recommendations to who?
Yeah.
Yes, well, that's, I'm going to ask everybody to look again at the charter for the group, and that is to produce recommendations on improving FOIA, and they can fall into legislative policy, executive action. Those are all open, and that's why we've tried to work with sort of these basic groups here in coming up with our topics. So yes, hopefully we're gonna have recommendations. And again, we've got a 2-year term to do it. That doesn't mean we have to wait 2 years to make a recommendation. If we get there earlier, that would be great. We can do these things sort of together in seriatim. That's for the committee to decide.
And I guess the Archives General Counsel is our legal advisor, so to speak, since we're through the archives?
Certainly for ethics issues, and certainly available for questions related to FACA.
All right, so from a FACA standpoint, I don't necessarily know what our individual responsibilities are with respect to any work product that we do, or if we get together and meet as a committee. Is that a meeting that has to be disclosed or should be disclosed that the public can come to, or do we preserve those records for inclusion in the committee? We don't have to have an answer obviously right now, but
good.
I don't know the FACA requirements.
You're right, we should get guidance from NARA's lawyer, but the FACA does talk, the regulations under FACA does talk about work papers of the committee, and that those are to be made public. So
and they need to be they need to be managed as federal records. Subcommittees, the rule, and we will get you additional guidance, but I do not have it today. The general rule is that subcommittees do not have to adhere to the same rules in terms of Federal Register notice and that sort of thing, but I'm just going to tell you our goal is going to be to try and be as open as we possibly can about when we're meeting, what we're talking about, and the work product that comes out of it. But I don't have all those answers right now, Mark.
And it's okay, I don't expect it for now. And how about looking towards, since we want to have some sort of end product, whatever that product will be, and hopefully interim products, but what about keeping the public informed? Are we authorized to create a Facebook page, a Twitter handle where we are posting updates or soliciting information from the public? I don't know what the rules are.
I don't either. Mark, I want you to make a note of every single one of those good questions. And
that's why it's recorded. That's why I'm not taking notes.
We're going to try and answer all of those things, but I don't have the answer today.
That would be a 6-hour meeting.
Yes, Krista says that would be a 6-hour meeting.
And lunch would be included.
So, I do...
And for the public.
We're going to try and answer all of those questions, and we're going to let everybody here and anybody who's interested know the answers to those questions. But what I would like to do right now is turn to our members of the public who are here, and let's hear comments, questions, concerns from anyone here, and we have about 20 minutes to do that. So if you want to speak, please come to the microphone so that your comments are part of the recording of this meeting. And please identify yourself and let us know where you're from, your affiliation, and who's going to be our first.
Hi, I'm Kel McClanahan. I'm from National Security Counselors. Most of the committee members know me, so I won't go into any great detail for an introduction.
Welcome, Kel.
Thank you very much. This is a great thing, and the one thing that, looking at what y'all have been talking about doing going forward, there's been an idea that was brushed by a couple times but never actually hit head on that I wanted to ask you to keep in mind whenever you're doing your projects, and that is there will be best practices and there will be agencies and that adhere to those, and by and large the agencies that have good practices do not need any help, and the agencies that do not have good practices generally have already been encouraged by OGIS or OIP or courts, for that matter, to do better and have not. And so whenever you look at addressing a problem, you need to keep in the back of your mind how to go about doing it such that even the most recalcitrant agencies don't have a choice. And this is where almost everything that we've addressed sort of boils down in some part to legislation or to some kind of oversight, accountability, where the good guys are good guys. They should be held up. They should be used as examples. And the bad guys should be required to do all of the things that you're saying everybody should do. And with that, just one very small thing that I wanted to mention. If y'all could have something like a single email address, that when somebody sends something there, it gets disseminated to the committee, rather than I write Mark and she writes Ann, and different people addressing different people, different members of the committee, that we could sort of ensure that anything that would be submitted to the committee would automatically sort of hit every member of the committee. They could ignore it if they want, but at least they would have it.
Okay.
Excuse me, I want to add, if I received an email, say from Kel, concerning committee business, does that become part of the committee record? That's something else, so I want to make sure.
So you can't delete them anymore?
No. So I do want to, if that's true, then how do we then get it to the committee for records management?
We're going to figure that out.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you, Kel. Cindy.
Hi. Hi there, I am Cindy Cafaro. I'm the Departmental FOIA Officer for the Department of the Interior. Those of you who know me are probably not surprised I'm speaking. I would like to respectfully disagree with the gentleman who just spoke in that I think that good practitioners, and I hope that my department is among the good practitioners, we try very hard, do need help. And I think that you have touched in this meeting on some of the areas that you really could help us. And I really liked Ms. Wiseman's formulation of the roadmap, because I think that's actually very helpful for you to think about and for all of us to think about, in that currently what exists, there are sometimes roadblocks, and we need real help to get past those roadblocks. I know this has come up already, but in the area of proactive disclosures, 508, I know it's not the most exciting thing to talk about, but it can be a real roadblock for agencies. If you can help us with that, that would be, if you did nothing else but that, this committee would have been a roaring success. The other thing is that when it comes to oversight, please, if we can focus on being a roadmap forward and not setting up new blocks. So for example, with oversight, as with so many things, if we're working on a new report, if we're working on a new audit, that's less time we have to spend processing your requests. And so there's a risk reward, positive, negatives, and so just please keeping that in mind and not setting up a new hurdle for us to get over that doesn't really add value would be greatly appreciated. And finally, I really like Ms. McCall, Ginger McCall's point on fees also being able to focus on reducing costs for everyone. As people have mentioned, that 1%, boy, that goes straight to Treasury. Boy, we're just salivating for that. But we do have legal requirements. We have legal requirements, and we're supposed to think about, what use are you going to put things to. And so, for example, someone mentioned in some agencies, people, give us a fee waiver, and some they don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Of course, that's because we're required to look, hopefully, if people are being rational, and let's assume for the moment they are, that's because we're supposed to look and say, okay, how are you going to use the information this time? And are you going to use this in a way that's going to further public understanding? And sometimes the same organization may give us a great write-up of that one time, and then the next time may not. And so working on ways that we can, sort of get past some of these smaller issues, bright lines, that would be really helpful, or just ways to reduce fee costs for everyone would be great. So thank you, we really appreciate it, and I think everyone can use your assistance.
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah.
Hi, Gavin Baker at the Center for Effective Government. First, thanks to all of the members of the committee and the staff who are assisting with the committee. I think that you've taken on a very important responsibility, and no pressure, but we're all counting on you to do really important and useful things. So I'd like to make two brief suggestions to the committee. The first is that I think you've picked a set of great issues to work on initially, but based on the conversation today, it seems like some of these issues have a little bit more in the way of problem definition than others. I think on proactive disclosures, we got a pretty good sense of what we see as the issue, what are we trying to fix here. On oversight and fees, it seems a little fuzzier still. On oversight, it seems to me that the key question is, what is it that needs more oversight? So if we can start with that point, then we can move on to, what kind of oversight is there already? Where are the gaps? How can we build something better? But first, we need some idea about where is it that we need to be looking, because you can't oversee everything all the time. It's just not possible. So there was some discussion about litigation, and that seems to me like one area where oversight would be useful. And then what are the other pieces of the process where there ought to be more oversight? On fees, conversation seemed to be starting to come around to this point, but to suggest putting a finer point on it, it seems to me that the key question is about simplification and streamlining of the fee process. That right now it is duplicative, it's slow, it's complex, it's burdensome for everybody involved. And so the main question, it seems to me, is about how can we move through the fee process in a way that is quicker, that is easier to do, and that is less burdensome. Although, you guys are the committee, so if you think that that's not the issue, then, you know, work on something else. But it seems like that's the crux of the issue. But, you know, in order to really make progress on these issues, it seems like we're going to need a little bit more definition. My second point related to that, I hope that these subcommittees or working groups or whatever they're going to be called will make use of the people outside of the committee, both outside of the government as well as the many folks inside the government who have their expertise and ideas to share. I know that we stand ready to help you guys, and I know that everybody else here does as well. So please make use of us. We want to work with you and help with everything that you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is David Pritzker. I'm the Deputy General Counsel of the Administrative Conference of the United States. We have well, let me say a word about who we are. We are a very tiny federal agency, which, by way of structure, is actually an advisory committee as well as being an agency. So we're very familiar with how a small group can deal with FACA requirements, and maybe there's some guidance we can give you on that. But our structure is such that we are a public-private partnership whose mission is to study issues of administrative procedures in the federal agencies and come up with recommendations for improved procedures. Well, it so happens, as most, perhaps all of you know, we have very recently completed one of these projects. At the suggestion of Miriam and OGIS, we undertook a study of recently litigated FOIA cases with an eye toward trying to see how best to use resources that are available to apply alternative dispute resolution approaches to avoiding litigation. I won't go through the whole story, but my purpose in mentioning this is that there is a report, a supporting report, which addresses many of the things that were talked about this morning. For example, there is a brief survey of state and international efforts in this area. There is a great deal of information on data about litigation. You may find this to be useful, and then of course there are the recommendations, which are partly directed toward the way OGIS carries out its responsibilities, but also partly directed to other agencies and how they might better interact with OGIS and use other resources. So the bottom line of all of that is that Miriam has copies of these things, and we'd like to have them entered into the official record of this committee. Two other brief points. One is that very clearly your intention as an advisory committee is to be as open as possible. And one of the things we do is that we do have live streaming webcasts of this kind of meeting, of all of our public meetings. And if we, as small as we are, with as tiny a budget as we have, can do this, there are ways it can be done, and I would strongly advise you to check that out. And then the last point I want to make is that I've emphasized how small we are. Whatever you recommend, please keep in mind that we're not all the Defense Department, we're not all the big agencies, we're not the Justice Department, and there are burdens on small agencies for any kind of government-wide practice or policy or requirement. Oh, and finally, we really are from the government, and we're here to help. So please call on us if there's any way we can be helpful.
Thank you, David. Let me just also mention that ACOS had a report and recommendation within the last couple of years. I want to say it was 2012, but I could be wrong. I'll look it up and make it available to the members of this committee, but a recommendation on FACA and for recommendations on how to use advisory committees even more productively. And I think it's really very helpful. So I'll share that with the members as well. Thank you.
you. I'm Sarah Kotler. I'm the Deputy Director of the FOIA program at the Food and Drug Administration. And I'm happy to be following Mr. Pritzker because I wanted to just echo your final point, not that we're a tiny little agency by any means, but we're not as big as some departments that taking a one-size-all approach, whether it's about the size of the agency or the requester community that agency tends to attract or the type of records that they tend to process more, would not be the best approach. There are a few things said that sort of made me go, oh my God. For instance, just for some strange reason, contracts at FDA do not seem to be a very popular item. I probably shouldn't say that, but it's true. We spend very, very few resources releasing contracts under the FOIA. And if suddenly we were to get a recommendation that all contracts have to be posted, would really turn our program on its head and would take precious resources away from the records that people really want and throw them into records that, quite frankly, nobody seems to want, or very few people seem to want. So I would hope that any recommendations in terms of proactive posting would at least allow agencies to make a determination of what people want from them and not just say what people may want from other agencies that tend to be popular. We all have different requester communities, which brings me to my second example on fees. I'm all for getting rid of fees for non-commercial requesters. It's just not worth the headache. The number of people you have to call and say, don't worry, you're not getting an invoice. It wasn't, you're not getting charged for that. But unlike many other agencies, the vast majority of our requesters are commercial. And so to say we don't want fees at all would have a very different impact on the Food and Drug Administration than it might have on some other agencies that mainly deal with media or nonprofit or consumers. So if we could just all remember that we are all very different. Consistency is great, but we want to make sure we take account of our differences as well.
Thank you. We will do that. Anyone else who would like to make a comment in the next 2 minutes? Well, let me assure you that you are not restricted to just right now. We do want to hear from you throughout this process. We are very mindful of how important it will be to have your participation in the work that the committee does. So if you're not speaking now, that doesn't mean that you will not have plenty of other opportunities to do that. We will try and keep everybody as updated as we possibly can on what we're doing, when we're doing it. The materials, again, we will make everything as available as possible on our website. Your handout has the URL, and we do invite you not only to look at it, but if you have suggestions for how we could do it better, we will. Mindful of David Pritzker's suggestion, we certainly, we at the National Archives will be looking into our capability for doing live streaming. We did not have that ability to do it now, and it may be that we've overlooked something, but we will be looking at that for the future. And one reminder, as you are leaving this building, we do have everyone, including staff, go through exit screening. If you have ever paid any attention to the news about the National Archives and Records and the loss of valuable documents, you know that we do not joke about this sort of thing. It's a reality. So you will all need to go through the exit screening, and we appreciate very much your cooperation in doing that. Unless a member of the committee wants to add anything at this point, I think we are going to stand adjourned. Thank you.
Well done.
I'd like like to, yes, I am, be able to have that we do at October, even if this is our structure, this is what we're looking at today. Start putting together.
Yeah, it was pretty bad, but it was better than the option, which was the opposite.
They all,
you again?
they all are supposed to go